Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome our first guest from the film The Creator, sound designer Erik Aadahl. Erik will talk us through the different soundscapes created for the film and the happy accidents and how they were made. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Erik. Hi, Erik. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I'm glad we could sit down and chat about The Creator, which I saw recently and really enjoyed. It is a film, I think it's like, if I had seen this when I was like 8 or 9 years old as a kid, it would be one of those films that you'd always think about for the rest of your life, because it's like, with sci-fi, it has that whole different element to sort of see a different sort of world visualized on the screen. And then also you get blown away by, wow, I can't believe it's like something like somebody can make this kind of film.
Yeah. No, I had the same kind of reaction when Gareth first started showing me some of the footage, and even before he had footage with just concept art, his whole vision of the future, this mix of ancient and totally new technologies, reminded me of some of my favorite science fiction movies from childhood. Like I got big Blade Runner vibes, and to me that's a classic. So it's as somebody working on the film, I think Gareth couldn't maybe have any higher praise from us when we started saying, hey, this kind of reminds us of our favorite films in film history. So
Yeah, and I think as well, like when you kind of are inspired by those elements as well, and then on top of that, adding your own little spin to it, it always makes the difference. Like makes a massive difference completely, as an audience member. And on top of that, you're kind of just sucked into a whole different world, and it just has that. I guess it's just such great world building. But on top of that, with sound as well, where you kind of have the freedom in a way of like, well, no one knows what this like what 20, what 50 odd years in the future is going to sound like. So, I've got a whole clean slate of doing whatever I want to do.
no, absolutely. And yeah, the kind of fun thing for me about sound design, just as you mentioned, is you can get really abstract with it. And you can really trick an audience member into thinking that what they're hearing is something that is connected to the screen, but it might be something totally different. So we do have, as sound designers, a lot of flexibility to use sound in strange, malleable ways. And that's something that Gareth, working with us intimately for many, many months, is obsessed about, is how to think outside of the box and to really try something new using sound that maybe hasn't been heard before, or in the case of The Creator, mixing sounds that you might be used to with sounds that are completely new and abstract and different.
Yes, and it's just as well like you can, I don't know, just play on all the different things that you can see as an audience member, but it's also when you're there with such visceral feeling as an audience is another thing where you kind of take in. Because it's like, since I started this podcast, it's amazing how much more appreciation you have for different things. It's not just the visual side of it, but also the sound and everything that gets played into what you're experiencing as an audience member.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We like to say that sound is half of the experience. You know, you're taking in a movie with your eyes and your ears, and in a funny way, the ears can be even more powerful in terms of directing audience emotion and attention, because it is kind of often subliminal, how we're kind of playing with the audience. one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, Walter Murch, amazing picture editor and also sound editor, said it this way. He said the images come in through the front door and the sound comes in through the back door. So we can be kind of very manipulate the audience's brains and emotions in some kind of powerful ways that aren't always very obvious.
Yes, and on top of that as well, when you have like you can be in a scene and then if you turn your head to the right you could hear conversations of what's happening to the side, or the speakers to the left, the conversations to the other side. And when you can play on those sort of things and disorientate an audience and kind of let them get lost in what's happening.
Yeah, and I mean, sound-wise, this movie was designed for high-end cinemas. So at Dolby Atmos, we used every single speaker and tried to create that full immersion for the audience. If people see it at home, they're not going to get the same experience as in the theater, which is how we've tuned it.
Just to sort of, before we go into the technical side, how did the project come about for you?
Well, let's see. So I worked with Gareth on his Godzilla movie, and on that one we met it's over a year before they'd started filming, and with the idea that we would design a new Godzilla roar to be unveiled at Comic-Con. And so we spent months together, kind of creatively going back and forth and coming up with ideas. And by the way, I think the reason he wanted me to work on his film Godzilla was because I've got experience in very high concept films, like very design heavy films, but also I have some background in art films like Terrence Malick, and we first bonded over kind of talking about Terry's style of filmmaking, and also one of our favorite movies that coincidentally for both of us is Baraka, which is such a cinematic kind of experience. So, that was, let's see, over 13 years ago, we started bonding over that. And after he finished Rogue One, and he was coming up with his next project, he kind of mentioned to me a few times, there's this dream project, a sci-fi film that we have to do together. And then, yeah, a couple years ago, we had dinner, and it was before they had started filming, and he was working on the script, but he had some concept art that he showed me. And that was kind of where the gears started turning, and started thinking about sort of the soundscape of this film, this mix of, Southeast Asian wilderness and nature locations combined with the futuristic and the sci-fi. And then before he started filming, he did a location scout, which was he went to 8 different countries, and he shot this location scout footage himself, came back and cut together a little 10-minute sizzle piece, is what we call it, kind of a proof of concept. And so I worked on the sound for that, and I was just blown away. Like, this is just something just so fresh and so new and different. In the jungles of Cambodia, but there's a robot that's a monk, walking past a temple. And when I first started on it, ILM had not quite done all of the visual effects. So Gareth would be like, okay, so that's going to be a human, but that's going to be a robot, and that'll be a full robot. So its head's going to look like a Sony Walkman. But this robot, it's going to be a simulant. So it'll have like the void between the ears and gears turning. So even without the visual effects, I started putting the sounds together. And it was kind of amazing once ILM started populating the shots that, it felt so grounded and gritty and real, but also so high concept. And Gareth applied that directly to the actual production, that same kind of philosophy of staying grounded, but also very sci-fi.
I think it's funny how you can, when you're working with people and the stuff that you bond over, sometimes depending on the workplace, it could be sports, it could be films, it could be music, or just sort of like general pop culture. It's funny when people mention Barocca as the film that's kind of inspiring this film, because I remember somebody at uni or college actually getting the Blu-ray. We always sit down and watching it, and you kind of get blown away by like watching something that is just visuals with music. And
It's an experience, it's like, what to me the magic of cinema is to bring you to a new place and experience something fresh. And I saw Baraka projected in 70 millimeter here in Hollywood at the Cinerama Dome in the 90s. And I couldn't stop thinking about it for months. It was, to me, kind of the apex of this combination between incredible cinematography and incredible sound, location sound, Michael Stern's score. It created this alchemy to me, which just reinforced, like, this is what I want to do. I want to work on movies.
like here we are. But I still think, again, like when you have those conversations with people about films that you both enjoy, and then you kind of pick scenes that you both love, and it's like, yeah, did you like this bit? Yeah, it's like I wonder how they did this bit. I wonder how they did that bit. Oh, what do you think happened here? Well, who knows? But it still looks incredible.
Mhm.
And I think as well, like if you're starting, because it sounds like you started on a project quite early on, and getting the sort of the location scout footage and sort of playing around with sounds there, that probably made it quite much probably easier once it got into production, what the sounds or establish what the sound of the world is, and how it could even determine the look of robots and what the world that they're building as well, because they can tweak whatever the visual effects is compared to what they're hearing. But when it comes to also the the shoot taking place abroad, how do you go about building the soundscapes for those areas? Do you go whilst they're shooting and sort of just walk around the landscapes that they're then walk around the locations that they're filming in, or do you have to build that completely from scratch because you're based in a completely different continent?
It's kind of a combination. And one of the sort of serendipitous things about this project is I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and have actually been to the locations that Gareth filmed in, from Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And whenever I travel, I bring recording rigs with me. And that's almost like a personal travel diary for me. And so over, yeah, the last 18 years of traveling, I've collected all these very exotic sounds from locations that wound up being in the movie. So that made it very easy. I could be very authentic with the locations and the habitats and the flavors of, what does a shanty town on the water sound like, and what are all the two-stroke engine longboats sounding like, and what are the exotic birds and the frogs, and what's the nightlife, the daylight, what are the insects like. And so it was kind of magical when I started to get the footage, and I was like, oh man, finally I can use like my favorite sounds that I've been collecting over all these years, like in a feature film.
Again, it's funny how you can prepare yourself for that sort of time where you're like, you know what, I've got my library ready. We can start building this world. And I think it's funny as well, like as a creative, like you never know when you're going to use certain things. I guess it's the same if you take photos as inspiration of an area that you visited, or even as you've done with sounds, or even doing videos of how certain things look. Because I think there's a moment in Everywhere, Everything, All at Once where Evelyn gets pulled through and they go through sort of different streets, and that was done in previs by the director just walking around on his iPhone. capturing the streets and then using that in his in the film later on. So it's not sort of, I don't know. I guess it's like it's just you're always going to be prepared with what you're building for later on.
No, that's right. And inspiration can come from anywhere. And the things I like about going out into the world and recording sounds is the stuff I'm not expecting. There are always happy accidents. And some of my favorite sounds are these like wonderful things I never would have thought of that as long as you're recording might manifest themselves and you can capture it. So,
It's one of those things where it's like a not it's like a collector when somebody's like, when are you ever going to use this? When will you ever need it? It's like, and then now's the time, and I've got it perfect. So there we go. But also in terms of like, because it's sci-fi, and you've mentioned some sci-fi films, and you can kind of see sci-fi elements as well, including, as you mentioned, Blade Runner, but also Terminator. And what I was thinking as well, when I was sort of just like pondering the questions I was going to ask is, how do you go about creating something that's slightly different to, say, those films, and not basically creating a copycat of those sound designs?
to me, it's really important not regurgitating things that have been done in film history, even though I might love them, but creating a new, fresh palette, something that's unique and bespoke to the movie. So with the creator, we kind of started, there's certain sounds in the film, like the tank battle, for example, where we're like, okay, these need to sound like giant tanks. Like, where do we start with that? And you start often with the literal, actual tanks with tank tread. And we're working to totally blank picture. When we got that sequence, there's just text on the screen saying tank. So after we'd gotten started, Gareth was like, well, these are going to be giant tanks. I'm like, oh, okay, well, how giant? And so then you start to scale and adjust, your kind of literal starting points. And so we started coming up with all sorts of different sounds for what these tanks could sound like. And, it was serviceable, but we knew it was not going to be the final thing. It was kind of, there's so much experimentation that goes into making the sound of a movie that it's rare that the first thing you try is what you're going to stick with. And as some of the art started to come in for what these tanks were going to look like, Gareth shared it with us, and we could see in the tank tread there were these voids. So it was almost like the tread was like there's nothing inside holding it together. It was kind of almost looked like an anti-gravity kind of tread. And so I started thinking about, well, okay, what kind of technology would create this? And my mind went to electromagnetic technology. And so I started playing with electromagnetic sounds and kind of deep hums that I put into a pulsing rhythm that reminded me of that rhythm of tanks. And we're starting to get a little closer to what felt right. But it wasn't until another one of these like happy accidents where I had a weekend off and went up to go skiing in Mammoth Mountain, and it's like a 5-hour drive from here in Los Angeles. And in one moment, the car veered off the highway just a little bit and hit the serrated median, and that it's used to keep drowsy drivers from driving off the road. But the sound lit up the entire car into this big whoa sound. And I thought, that's the tank. And I pulled over, got my rig out, hit record, and just like recorded every variation I could of that at different speeds, going in and out of it. And that became that sound of the tank. And yeah, I love those kind of happy accidents. But so anyways, and other things might be just more literal though too. Like we've got a whole variety of robots, the most advanced one being Alfie. And then there's fellow simulants who, they look like humans but have this void in their heads. So we wanted them to feel kind of more high tech and more advanced than, say, the robots that looked more vintage, like Gareth's actual direction, I think, to VFX supervisor and the art director, where some of the robots should look like, not like Apple iPhone version of a robot, but should look like a vintage Sony Walkman version. So they'd have big blocky heads. And so they had to sound a little bit more vintage, not just with their servo movements, but also with their voices. And so the simulants are much more pure vocal kind of treatment, whereas the more rudimentary robots, Gareth loves the 1970s sound of like some of the robots from THX 1138, where also Walter Murch designed, where he would use vocoders, like analog vocoders, to do the treatments. And there's a wonderful sci-fi vintage quality to a vocoder. So that's actually what we did for a lot of the robot vocals, is use digital vocoders, where we could get a human to perform the lines, and then I can extract the MIDI notes of what note each syllable or vowel is doing, and then plug that through the vocoder with MIDI automation to create a whole variety of different treatments. And the way we set things up was that we wanted to be able to be fluid with how much we're using, all the way to the very end of the final mix. So if we wanted to dial it up or dial it down, we had that kind of flexibility.
To sort of go dive into your answer, I think it's quite, again, those happy accidents where I've hit those like that side of the road where you just, because sometimes you swerve because there's like a large vehicle next to you and you're like, well, that person's definitely, something's happened to them, and then you hear it and it is scary, especially when you hear it reverberate through your car. But with those happy accidents as well, like the funny how you just sort of needed that moment when you're like, okay, it's my time off, you're kind of switched off from everything, and then boom, it happens. And I don't know what that, you sometimes like that idea is like very hard to describe to someone, because it's just it's like a lightning in a bottle moment that you can't really capture, and it's just something that happens and you just have to go with it. And the fact that you still had your rig with you and you went round and was doing it at a different speed, even though you probably really wanted to get to skiing, is hats off to sort of your creativity and how you work.
Well, I don't remember the skiing as much as I remember that moment. It was like a little epiphany, and sometimes those epiphanies happen like not just when you're unplugging and taking a weekend, but during work too. I mean, there's countless moments where I remember on Transformers, when I was designing that, I was trying to come up with a vocal treatment for Megatron. And I was creating all these plugin chains of processing, and everything was starting to kind of sound the same, and I was getting bored. And then suddenly something just tweaked in the software, and it created this kind of evil electronic sound. I went, whoa, where did that come from? And I noticed in the audio source that I was using, I was missing a fade. So there was just like a hard cut, and that little thing pinged the software in this bizarre accidental way. And again, happy accident that I was like, oh man, I'm going to do this for everything for this character, is use that accident for his source material. And I never would have thought to digitally glitch my processing chain to create that, but it was a little epiphany kind of moment. And I always think about those kind of things when working, like what are the things, how do you do something wrong and break it? And actually, this is something that I love about Gareth, is he very much directs that way too. He's like, okay, there's the safe way to do something, the conventional way that's been done a million times, but it's going to work. And then there's the risky out of the box thing that hasn't been done, and it might not work, but if you have a choice, do that every single time. And it's so freeing creatively to have a director give you the license to take it as far as you can take it, and not just rest on the comfortable or the tried and true, which in cinema I think is all too common. Like, look at the movies being greenlit. It's like sequels, the same thing. Like, okay, this thing worked, let's do it again. Uh, and I love movies that take risks, and I like taking risks in the process. To me, that's what's inspiring.
I think now, like, we kind of in a way of like how films are going, it does there does seem to feel like there's a lot less risky films, or if there are risky films, they're not, very few are being made, or sort of
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily advertised, but I don't think people are taking a risk of going to see them. And it's always quite a shame, because it's like a film that might have come out a few years ago hits Netflix or another streaming site, and it becomes really popular, and people are like, oh, why didn't I know about this film? And you just think,
Yeah.
if only if it was, if people would go out that sort of weekend to see it and support it, then this could have had a lot of legs, and you could have seen more of this sort of films from certain filmmakers. But such is life.
I
But
know. Well, and it's, I cited Blade Runner as a huge inspiration. When that came out, it fizzled, and it took years for it to become a cult classic that was like universally praised. And sometimes things are either ahead of their time, or they just don't hit the right moment, and are, like you said, appreciated later on Netflix. So,
yeah, and it's crazy to think like Blade Runner, and then like now so many people love that film. Even in London, they've got a cinema called the Prince Charles Cinema, which do double bills with Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, and they're quite popular as well. It's just, no matter how many, like how you study human behavior and the economics of the world, it's like stuff like that can never probably be explained as like how it can flop, and then everybody, and then within 20 years or so, 30 years or 40 years, people are still going to it and being inspired by it and are enjoying it. There
yeah,
must be some sort of case study to be done on that, but
it's the mystery of art. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. On top of like though the sci-fi elements and the sort of nature elements, there's also stuff like combats and explosions. Now, I guess like as humans, we've seen quite a lot of explosions in film. We've seen how they sort of sound, look, and feel. But when you have a film like this, like The Creator, and you have it tuned to the Dolby Atmos and for the big screen sort of setting, how do you go about creating the sound for an explosion that somebody might have heard already, but amplifying that to the point where it doesn't blow the speakers, but it really blows away the audience, so they can really feel the power of the blast?
Yeah, I treat explosions differently depending on what the scene is, and what the context is. There are some explosions in the film where we play them very muted because it's a emotional kind of moment, and we want it to be a contemplative explosion, not a rock, shake the seats explosion. So it really depends on the context. But one of the kind of special things about this film is we have a lot of dynamics in the film. So there isn't always this wall of music going, and we have these really kind of quiet moments. And if something like an explosion comes out of that quiet moment, it's going to sound 10 times bigger than if it's coming out of a not quiet moment. So contrast and dynamics is a really big part of it. And then, to me, I love low end. So I love playing with subharmonic synthesis to create low-end bends and shock waves and anything that I can feed the subwoofer that feels pure. I just personally love that sort of stuff as somebody, as an audience member myself. And then, you know, some explosions you can do some very strange things with. Like in this movie, we added shrieks to some of the explosions during the floating village attack, and I recorded a baboon shrieking and topped those on the incoming missiles for some of these explosions. And to me, that gives not just a volume and dynamic contrast, but also a frequency contrast. So, you know, I sort of think of sound as a porpoise. You're always like a dolphin. You're always dancing, not just volume wise, but frequency wise. So being very using intent with the frequencies is very important, because more is not more. More sound will become muddier, will become more brown. It's kind of like paint. You smear all the colors of paint together and you get mud. And the same is true with sound. So I find that the more I can subtract and the more essential I can get with what's being presented, the more visceral, the more pure, and the more impactful it can be. And you know, that's one thing I always try to teach our crew and, you know, sound designers who are just trying to get started is they think, oh, I've got 1,000 tracks in Pro Tools, and if I use every track, it's going to be great. And it's like, no, the opposite is true. Like, you know, if you can use one sound in a moment and it's the right sound, you're going to get way more purity, and it's going to be much more cinematic than if you use 10 sounds or 20 sounds. For me, it's how does it sound, and how can you keep it simple but bold. Like all of my favorite sounds in film history are just one sound, like R2-D2. It's not a bunch of layers. It's one sound at a time. So that's a long way of answering your question about how I approach explosions, but the same is true for every sound, really.
We are so used to seeing big explosions on screens, and a lot of blockbuster films always try to top one another. How can we be bigger? How can we be this? How can we do that? And I think it's always interesting to, as an audience member, to think about, well, how do these things come about? How do people decide these things? How do they want to change these up? How do they want to create this explosion for the world? Because it's very easy to hear certain things in real life, to then have it on screen always will sound different and slightly, how could I say it, just like, I think you want to get that feeling of that real world, but then also you want to know that it's fake in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. And your question kind of plays into something that I love about how Gareth shoots and how he choreographs scenes, is he's always changing perspectives. So you might be right in the middle of the battle, but then he'll cut wide and you'll be, you know, half a mile away from the action. And those wide shots is where I can create context and create perspective, and where you can hear the environment. So an explosion at a distance, I can have it rippling through the mountainside, and that's telling a different story. It's telling the story about scale and geography and relativism. And then you cut in close, and then I'm not going to use that kind of necessarily realistic explosion that's rippling through the canyons. Instead, I'll use something that maybe is tilted more to the synthetic, where I can really punch the transient and fill up every speaker. And it's kind of, to me, that's sort of a dance between wide perspectives, close perspectives, hearing more of the environment, and then ripping that out and just using one big visceral kind of moment. I love doing that as a sound designer, and I usually have to push filmmakers to think that way, to think about perspective. and environments and geography. And with Gareth, it's like you don't even need to have that conversation. He's already thinking that way.
Like sometimes with directors, you're not really going to think about the geography and how is something like this sound going to reverberate through mountains and valleys, and how certain things are going to be, basically. I think really, so you really pointed out like one of my favorite scenes in the film is when they have those robots are basically suicide robots running along the bridge, because you hear the really hard thump sound of what's coming. You don't know what it is, but when it explodes and the explosion is seen from up the top, so you can see it from the bridge and just the size of it and what it sort of really signifies in that sort of way, and just seeing that being like, whoa, holy crap, this is bad.
Yeah, and then we cut in close, and that's where you feel like the shockwave of debris and the bits of wood from the bridge like flying past the characters right there on the spot. So that's a great example of how shifting perspectives can give you both the scale, but then also put you there with the characters.
Yeah, and it's those sort of moments as well where you think, wow, like this is these things, they're not here to mess about. They come to really destroy and wipe people out.
Yeah, we
Um,
call them G13 and G14, the bomb robots. And because AI is banned in the West, they're like a much more rudimentary kind of robot. They're pre-programmed for their mission. But I love Gareth's sense of humor that he gives them a little line that's like a pre-programmed, non-sentient kind of line, like "It's been a pleasure serving with you, ma'am," and then they run off to to blow up.
yeah, like that did get a chuckle from the audience, even though then you think like, actually, wait a second, this is not good. But there's also because you're a sound editor in the film as well, and before we sort of jump into those sort of jump questions, I'm curious to know, like, what does a sound editor do on a film? I know it says in the name you edit the sound, but what does it take to undertake the role?
Yeah. So yeah, my title is supervising sound editor and sound designer. So as the supervising sound editor, with my partner Ethan van der Rijn, who shares the title, we oversee the sound editing team. And so within that sound editing team, we'll have a Foley editor, we have dialogue editors, we have sound effects editors, and different. Those are the basic departments. And so as a supervisor, my job is to kind of corral everybody into a shared vision, and then I do my own sound editing as well and sound design. But the way we work is once all the different departments have started to put together their scenes, they all get combined into kind of one master session. And I like to work that way because I don't like all of our sounds coming together late in the game when we hit the mixing stage. I like all that sound editing to be as theatrical as possible right away. So like I put the movie up in this room and monitor in 7.1, and we're doing the panning, we're doing mixing, it's kind of because of the technology now, we can make a film sound pretty finished just in a small room like this, and be able to then bring it to the big mixing theater and have it translate pretty well. So yeah, as our whole team of sound editors, everyone is kind of thinking that way. Like, how is this going to translate to the finished product?
And do you find that as you're editing sound into into scenes, being a sound designer as well, does that make you easier for your job? Because then if there's like, can you tweak this? Can you just add more? You can kind of do it at the same time and then sort of do it in real time by adding it in afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's how we do it. And I find that directors love that too. When we're doing reviews, in rooms like this, if they have ideas, we just implement them on the spot, like right away. And and then we do that during the mix as well. And that's often, sometimes you have some of the greatest ideas just on the spot. And it's not how it used to be, 25 years ago when nothing was digital. And if you wanted to fly something in, to the edit or the sound edit or the sound mix, you have to get a recording transferred onto mag and then hang it on the dubbers. Here I can just press one button, import it into our master session, and it's right there. It's kind of instant gratification.
But I guess as well that makes it just easier for everybody to do that, right? Like you're there and somebody's like, oh, what work would be this? It's like, yeah, 2 seconds, boom, 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 done. What do you think about this? Can we add a bit more? Yep, no problem. Add a bit more, add a bit more. And it probably helps a lot with scenes that are pretty much probably close to being completed and just needing that little bit of extra sort of, what is it? Just the extra bit of salt added to it just so that it's perfect.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, we have a nickname for those kind of sounds, or sweeteners. So and it happens all the time, especially in very visual effects heavy movies where you put up the new we're getting picture updates multiple times a day, and you put a scene up again, like, oh, now we see a lot more tracers flying across the screen in this scene. And you just bloop bloop bloop, like put them in, pan them, get it right. And usually it's pretty quick. Some things can, maybe we take them into the back room if it need if it's a little more complicated. But like you said, at that point, it's often just little salt and pepper, hit little sweetening moments to make it what it could be.
And I think as well, like if there's moments with directors where they could say, yeah, we just add a bit more, because I can imagine that sometimes there are scenes where you need a bit more suspense than you need in somebody's running away. You want to keep building up to that moment of like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I guess it's the same with like in The Creator where Alfie and John David Washington's character, whose name escapes me at the moment,
Joshua.
Joshua, they're hiding away when they're going to see Joshua's friend. So there are times when the sound design is like having that fear of like the police or a member of public finding you because your image is being broadcast everywhere, and it's a case of like kind of need to get off the street and make sure that we can hide away from what's happening.
No, that's absolutely right. Tension is often created with those kind of things, or subtracting things as well. Like for some of those scenes, like you're mentioning, where Joshua and Alfie are on the run, sometimes subtracting things, so it can create a really interesting subconscious reaction in an audience, where if you can make people start to lean in and kind of hold their breath with the tension, oftentimes subtracting sound can kind of achieve that. And yeah, that's I think part of the fun of it, is not just adding, but taking things away.
And I think there's quite a lot of well, not quite a lot, but when in terms of like when you can take stuff away and add and create a sort of different vibe to the scene in terms of just how people are reacting to the sound as well. Just because as well, you could play around with people, with audience members by adding sound, being like, did I hear that correctly? I'm not sure. And then you kind of like let that build up in your mind, being like, well, maybe I did think that, maybe I didn't. Well, what's going on here? And it helps with building up for characters. And how they're feeling and the sort of environment that they're experiencing in. But yeah, just to wrap up the episode, what was your favorite scene to do the sound design for?
Oh gosh, the whole movie. um, let's see. Well, I love Nomad. I love Gareth's design of Nomad. So some of my favorite sounds are related to Nomad, both its tracking beams, it's got these sort of blue laser-like beams that sweep over the terrain from orbit to target. And it looks so beautiful. And Gareth kind of designed Nomad to look like this giant bird of prey. And ironically, Nomad is built by the West, but it is kind of the only sound that's featured in the movie that is purely synthetic. So it's complete like synthesis sounds, and Gareth's direction for that was he wanted it to sound radioactive. So as if you put your hand into this blue beam and you held it there for just too long, you'd get cancer. It should feel noxious and dangerous. So that's one of my favorite sounds. And I mentioned a couple other scenes. I love when we're in space and we take out all the sound, and Joshua's in his space suit in the vacuum of space, but Alfie's just standing there as if nothing's happened. She doesn't need to breathe. She's a robot. And there's something that kind of gave me goosebumps the first time we decided, okay, we're going to follow the laws of space and we're just going to take out every sound. The only things you hear are the radio communication and the Solidian sounds of Joshua inside his spacesuit. I absolutely love that. And then I'll add one more thing, and that is my favorite moment. And it was actually the first scene we ever started working on, which is the kamikaze robot sequence you talk about, where G13, or no, it's G14, runs out and is intercepted by Alfie standing there. And she has this power over technology, which is kind of why she is this super weapon. And she steps up, the robot kind of kneels, and she steps up to this robot and puts her hand on its forehead. And we take out all of the sound for a beat. We go into like this different type of consciousness, and then play this low kind of energy sound that builds and builds and builds until, I'm not going to spoil it, but something happens to Alfie. And that was the sound of a didgeridoo. One of my friends plays didgeridoo, and I love using organic sounds for synthetic things. Sometimes it creates a fun alchemy. But I remember when we first constructed that scene, I got chills. I thought, oh, this is so fun. This is so cool. And that sequence, even though it was the first thing we ever worked on, did not change very much over the year that we were doing our sound design on the film. It was one of those moments where it's like, okay, the first stab at it was the one that stuck.
Firstly, they're solid choices. I think when you're shooting a scene in space, I think you have to, you do follow the laws of space, that the sound is a vacuum. And I guess that like, it's a very easy way to, there's been a number of films where you could probably use that as an example. But I think sometimes as well, it's like, how do you bring your own sort of sound design to it all, just because you want to convey what's happening and like the panic in one person and then the calmness of another one, because they don't really understand that you can't, as a human, you can't breathe in space. And having that air supply as a ticking time bomb is a great way of building up the suspense, and having the radio on in the background where there's just so much going on. And you think, oh my gosh, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? And on top of that, I think as well, like, because your second one was like the thumping of the sound as well, and how it didn't change much from the initial conception, which it makes me think a lot in terms of how, I guess, confident people are in their work, but also knowing what needs to be made into the scene. Excuse my language, but somebody who needs to be shit hot for that to be kept to the set. It doesn't have that many changes, considering there's one of the first scenes that they start doing, and that it doesn't change until much until the final picture lock, which is a testament to your work and how much how much effort and understanding of what the scene needs in terms of sound, which is again crazy to think that we kind of did it in like a one take wonder sort of thing.
Like what we do is very complicated. It's very technically complicated, and there's a lot that can go wrong. But what makes it simple to me is sometimes you have to stop thinking with your brain and experience it with your gut, and use your intuition and your gut. And when that tells you, oh, this is working, like I'm getting a emotional reaction, it's pulling me into the scene, then that I listen to that more than I listen to whatever million things are buzzing around my head. Like that's the ultimate check mark for me. Okay, if I can give myself goosebumps, if I can surprise myself, only then will I be able to surprise a director or an audience. So that's kind of my internal thermometer for, is it working or not?
It's obviously been working really well considering how long you've been working, the awards that you guys have been nominated for. So you guys are doing something right, and long may it continue.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it, Robert.
No problem.
Thank you.
Do you know what? Sorry. Before you go, I've got one more question. I'll put this on. Sorry, this has popped into my head. You mentioned about the sound design and how it's designed for the big screen and for the Dolby Atmos. What's going to happen when the film hits streaming home videos, people watch it on their iPhones or whatnot? What happens to the sound design then? Do you guys still tweak with it later on, or do you keep it as it is?
Yeah, so there's the theatrical mix, and there's many different formats for the theatrical. There's Dolby Atmos, there's IMAX, IMAX 12.0, IMAX 5.0, there's 7.1, there's 5.1. Those are the theatrical formats. And we spent a lot of time getting those to work in the optimal way for each format. And the same is true for home theater, which our nickname for that are near fields. And, it's the same sound, it's just contained in ideally the optimal way. So, and for home theater, there's also a bunch of formats. There's home Atmos, which is 9.1.6. There's 7.1, there's 5.1, there's stereo. So we're very careful about creating each one of those formats to play in the best way in the home environment. And I encourage people to invest in a home Dolby Atmos setup to enjoy the creator in the best way they can at home. But if you're not able to do that, a good pair of headphones is going to be awesome too. So,
Okay, cool. Still just curious more about the way the sound is always going to be mixed and how viewers are going to be watching it at home. I guess now, like as audience members, it varies on how you watch things. Like, unfortunately, I do watch stuff now with subtitles, and it makes me feel a bit of an old man doing it. So, but at the same time, you kind of want to take in everything that's happening. But it's still, yeah, I don't know. It's always interesting to hear how this sort of comes about and how sound designers need to cater for those at-home audiences now.
yeah, well, in the past, there was home theater mixes were much more compressed. And that's so the quiet things come up and the loud things come down. So you're not, if somebody is playing at a low level, they're not missing half of the soundtrack, for example. But what the general consensus now is, if you're going to do that, do it very subtly and minutely, because the worst thing you can do is flatten the peaks and raise the troughs, and you just get a plateau effect. We don't want that. We want dynamics. So to get everything to fit into some of these formats, what we'll often do is turn everything down And so then we can get to full scale. And at home, though, that means that you're going to be turning it up. In the beginning, it might be like, oh, this is feeling a little low, and you turn it up. And that's what we want, because that's where you'll get the peaks and you'll hear the details as well. And those, yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that sort of more technical insight, just because there's always, again, something interesting to learn about how the difference in the sound in cinema to what people are like at home.
Cinema is easy for us because, if it's a good theater, it's reference level. So there's no like, I'm going to turn it up or down. It's set at reference level. And we like that. At home, it's kind of the Wild West. It depends on whatever your stereo or your TV is set to. So,
Exactly. And I think it's always going to be a never-ending way of a never-ending sort of fights. Fight might be a bit of a strong word, but for audiences and people to have the best sound and whatnot. Erik, thank you so much for your time today. Creators now on VOD. Go out, check it out, and enjoy Erik's work.
Thank you.
Erik, thank you again. You take care, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.